Good afternoon. My name is Louise Mushikiwabo. I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Rwanda. And I'm here to introduce to you a very interesting discussion. First of all, a warm welcome to all of you to Kigali and to Rwanda. I cannot think of a better way to kick off the Kigali edition of the World Economic Forum on Africa than with this very special conversation we're about to have among three consequential leaders of our time. Tony Blair and Howard Buffett are Rwanda's partners, close partners, and they have made a difference in this country and elsewhere. But we cannot claim them for ourselves, so we want them to engage with you as well. As for President Kagame, he is the man, along with a few men and many, many women, behind the transformation of this country. So I don't want to take away from what we're going to have, which I can guarantee is going to be an exchange that is interesting, thoughtful, and candid. So I'd rather you hear from them in their own words. And so let me hand over to Tony so we can enjoy the conversation all together. Mr. Blair.
Thank you very much indeed, Louise. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Welcome to everybody. Thank you, Louise, for the wonderful work you do on behalf of Rwanda. And I'm in the position of being a kind of moderator of this conversation, but also a participant. And we're going to split it into three sections. One is about the partnerships that people like me and people like Howard have with Rwanda and what it means for us. The second part will be specifically around the challenges for Africa in growth and development. And then thirdly, we'll look at aid, its role, and how that role might change over time. So I'm going to kick off actually with you, Howard. I think you've been to virtually every country in Africa. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
It may be actually every one?
Yes.
Wow.
Including the two disputed territories. Had to get that in there.
Well, they're still disputed, unfortunately, but
yeah.
Despite the visit. But so you've been to every country in Africa, but you have made a special commitment to Rwanda. Why Rwanda?
Well, we've worked in 44 countries on the continent, and I've been a permanent resident of South Africa for over a decade. So I've spent a lot of time on the continent, and I've learned a lot. I have a lot to learn, but what I wanted to do years ago was to try to determine how to really have a different way forward for a country on the continent to develop their agriculture. And honestly, 10 years ago, we didn't pursue it because we could not think of a country for sure that we had the confidence that we could partner with the government and be assured that we could get done what we needed to do. So when we looked at Rwanda and we spent more time here, we have learned through we were first here back in 1999 working on conservation issues, so we've been here a long time doing different things, but we wanted to really invest some serious money. And Rwanda has turned out to be an incredible partner. When we show up here in this country, we know that we can do what we need to do. We know we can meet with who we need to meet with. We know that the Rwandans who tell us that certain things are going to be done when we come back, they're always done. I've been incredibly impressed with the Rwandans that we have worked with on the project that we've got going now, which is a very complicated project. So Rwanda is a true partner, and that is a huge difference. That's different than going in. We've done many projects in Africa, but they're just projects. They haven't been able to go to scale. They haven't been able to change policy. They haven't been a true partnership, and Rwanda has been a true partnership.
And you've watched that develop over these past years. And you're actually about to take it all to a whole new level.
We hope.
You hope. But this for you has been a commitment in part because of the way Rwanda functions as a country and as a government.
There's no question about it. I mean, I remember once stopping in 2013 to see President Condé. In fact, I believe you set the meeting up in Guinea. And I didn't write it down, so I won't get it perfect. But he asked me where I was going from here, and I said, well, I'm heading to Rwanda. And he said, you know, there's many of us on this continent that have great respect for Rwanda, and we would aspire to be more like them. That is a huge endorsement. That's an endorsement that means more than someone like me. And you only get that endorsement when you have made major changes and had huge success. And so I see Rwanda as a country where there are no surprises. I show up and I know what to expect, and I believe I know what we will be able to expect 5 years from now, and that's a big difference.
So there's a predictability about the way the country operates and the way it works.
No investor wants to invest anywhere where you don't have stability and predictability. I mean, you'll take so much risk as an investor, but most investors want a reasonable amount of predictability, and Rwanda is exactly that.
Right. Mr. President, if I can turn to you. So you've obviously got a partnership with my organization, Africa Governance Initiative, and partnership with Howard Buffett. I mean, in terms of the changes that the country's made over these past years, how important are, and what is the value of those partnerships? I mean, not these simply specifically, but I mean, the partnerships that you have with the outside. I mean, how has that helped the country develop?
Well, thank you. Let me start with these partnerships in particular that we have, whether it's Howard Buffett's foundation or Tony's African Governance Initiative, and then I will explain later on. From what we get with the Howard Buffett, first of all investors are very good, but you can categorize them in a number of ways. There is an investor who has a part of that mind of investment on the philanthropic side and does the combination, meaning for Howard to have made the decision to invest in Rwanda, it's not just based on saying, I'll put my money in Rwanda, I'll get high returns for it, and that's it. I think he had another idea behind that. This is a good investment in as far as it also has a huge impact on the transformation of this country's economy. Therefore, it has impact on people as well. So I wanted to say this is a very high quality investment in that. Then to your own, Tony's attention and investment in our country, AGI, building capacity, so that we are able to deliver on a number of things we want to deliver, whether it's an infrastructure or governance generally or matters to do with the growth of our economy and so on and so forth. We need people who understand what they are doing, so the investment in that area is very important. So the strength of partnership, therefore, is very key. Howard Buffett Foundation, your own AGI, bring the kind of, assets that we don't have. They bring different experience to fill the gaps that are there in our own systems to be able to continue growing our economy and advancing and developing the way we want. So partnerships are very key, are very important. So it's government, it's the private sector, it's philanthropy, all these are very key, and it has to be in a combination of all these different areas.
But I think, when I think about my own experience here and why I think it is worked for you and for us, I think for the outsider, you need the predictability and the stability, and you need the right address from government. For the government, obviously, they need people who are coming in and wanting to commit to the country. But if I can just dig a bit on this, obviously, I founded my initiative because of my actual experience in government. Because I'll never forget the first day I came into Downing Street on the 2nd of May, 1997. We obviously won a big election victory, and you come in and everyone's cheering and everyone was thinking, this is a great moment. And I'm kind of getting more and more nervous about the expectations of what we're going to be able to do. And I remember coming into Downing Street, and then you go in the front door and you go down to the end of the corridor, and there was sitting the senior British civil servant, just in the cabinet room, and he sort of motioned me to the chair next to him. And then he said to me in that very British way, he said, well done. And then he said, now what? And, the now what is the thing that really hits you, when you're in government. And, I made the mistake in my first couple of years in government, thinking, because I was the Prime Minister, I thought I must be relatively important. And if I sat around the cabinet table and I took a decision, something happened. Right? I realized this is a big fallacy. Mm-hmm. Right? The fact that I take a decision is the start. It's not the end of the process. Mm-hmm. Now you, Mr. President, you see, we'll get on to all the challenges in a moment, but just to record the fact, the progress that Rwanda's made has been, I think, by common consent, remarkable, and you just visit Kigali and you see the progress and the change. But all of that came through a process of decision-making. So what I think is quite interesting for people is to, in your mind, did you have a clear idea of some of the basic things you had to get right in order to make the country move?
Yes. Well, I think ours here in Rwanda has been a very big now what. At least for you, you had where to start from. Right. Running a government. Running every government has its own complexities from country to country and so on. Ours was probably complex on another scale, starting more or less from nothing, from scratch, and we had to start building something, trying to create value almost out of nothing. So that is why I was saying it was a very big now what. And the moment we got started anyway, and we had mobilized everybody's mind to say, we need to do something to change the situation. If you look where we started from 22 years ago and where we are, it had to involve everybody's participation. It's leaders, it's the citizens, it's the connection between the leadership and the people being led, and saying, we need to create something for ourselves. We need to have a future. We've lost the past, but we need to regain the future. We have to do something. So that's how we really started. And we started from the basic things, the infrastructure, businesses starting to function, it's security that people need, it's the schools, it's health, institutions, and many things like that.
And corruption?
Oh yes, that comes as a way of dealing with the governance issues. Because to have all these things work and get results, there is a whole governance process. And leaders have to be asking themselves, how do we get there? And you have resources, financial resources, you have people. They need to come together so that you get the results that you want. So corruption is that part you need to address in utilization of resources to get the results that you want. And corruption is something that, you will find everywhere, all over the world. But you have to start from creating that situation or the environment where people will not just get involved in corruption because you understand the consequences, and they have this feeling that they will get away with it. Everybody has to understand the consequences of, say, diverting resources that were meant to deliver on health or education or agriculture or infrastructure and so on and so forth. In our situation, the consequences are huge. So we have to figure out how do we hold ourselves and each other accountable so that really we are trying to do the best things we need to do in order to deliver on the results.
You took a very clear position on that right from the very beginning. Right. And I think that is also, Howard, for people like you, part of the attraction in coming here.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that, but also this question, which I think is really important in terms of outside partnerships. I mean, your institution and foundation, I mean, is kind of nimble, okay? I mean, it goes where it wants to go and it works, you know, in a flexible and non-bureaucratic way. I mean, say a little bit about the way that you do your interaction too, because I think this has got an important lesson for the way that international institutions function.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges with anybody that's working in development is that there's different constraints on taking risk. And so our foundation, I don't have an investment committee, and I have a board, but I meet with them once a year and tell them what I did. And they haven't fired me yet. But you know, I see our money, I see private foundation money, not just ours, as risk capital of philanthropy. And so the reason for that is that we can make quick decisions. You know, we built a project in one country where when we started it was in the middle of conflict, and where we were working was shelled with RPGs. I mean, most people won't do that. But I thought it was important to keep moving. I mean, you have to give people, I learned this in Afghanistan. I've never been a big infrastructure guy. I've never been, you know, I think more about people and how to change lives more directly. And when I went to Afghanistan the first time, I saw these buildings and these roads, and I thought, you know, I just don't get why that's so important in the middle of, you know, there was fighting was still going on very, all over. And one of the guys said to me that I was with, he said, people have to have hope. They have to think that they have to believe that things can change. And I learned that lesson in Afghanistan. So we ended up doing some things differently there than we typically would. And it's probably changed how we do things here and other places. But people have to believe that things can change. And to do that, sometimes they have to see something. And, you know, one of the projects we're working on here, and I'll call it semi-jointly with DRC, is we're rebuilding one of the border crossings. And you talk about corruption. And when I told this story to somebody, their first reaction was, oh, this is terrible. And I thought, no, it's a perfect explanation of why Rwanda is so different. You have a couple different kinds of corruption. You have institutional corruption, and that corruption is really, really difficult to deal with, and it undermines rule of law and governance and all the things you must have to be successful. It's difficult. But you have other countries where corruption just kind of leaks in and out of places, you know, and people take advantage of things, and they're, you know. And so we had this situation on the border where one of the architects was actually trying to get a kickback on a construction contract. And I started telling this, and this person's like, wow, you know, that's Africa. And I said, no, you're not, you haven't let me finish the story. I said, immediately that person was turned in, and immediately that person was arrested. And they're going through the court process now. That, to me, is the difference with Rwanda. That means that look, things go wrong in every country. They go wrong in the UK, they go wrong in the United States, they go wrong in every country we've ever worked in. The question isn't whether things go wrong. The question is the process in place to deal with it equitably and fairly and quickly? And Rwanda has that process. And, you know, a partnership, people often think of, you know, a partnership as kind of this great marriage and everything's working all the time. things never work right all the time. A partnership really, you find out what kind of partnership you have when things don't go right. You find out if you trust people when things don't go right. And so, you know, we have a high level of trust, the highest level of trust that you could have in this government and the people we work with. And so, you know, I just think that Rwanda stands out in terms of what they've accomplished. And we have 100 examples, just like what we went through at the border, that I think prove it.
Right. If I can turn to the sort of growth and development side, you know, it seems to me that for developing countries today, there are certain, you know, basic things that they have to get right, where in a world of mobile technology and capital, if you get those things right, then your country can really move forward. Now, the rule of law was and anti-corruption is one that we've touched on, but some more practical things, if you like, on the ground. Mr. President, for example, electricity infrastructure. Today, these are huge challenges for every country. I mean, basically, if you have electricity, you have power, you know, you have access to technology, you know, you are hugely enabled as a country. Likewise, if you've got farmers in remote places and they don't have a proper infrastructure that gives the roads to the market, then they can't, you know, they can't raise their standard of living. For you, what have you kind of learned through trying to do these challenges, and what would you say are the biggest challenges for you and for other similar African countries right now?
I'm glad we started with when corruption was mentioned. I really keep saying it's a governance issue. You have really to deal with these things. It's the rule of law, it's governance, it's fighting corruption so that people don't practice corruption with impunity, though I maybe come to that later, with the costs that come with it. Fighting corruption so hard to try and lower the levels significantly really has a huge political cost, but the cost of corruption is much higher than the political costs you incur in the process. So it's easy to make the sort of trade-offs you want. So once you've fixed this, and alongside that, many things are happening still in terms of fixing what needs to be fixed in terms of infrastructure and putting in place institutions so that there is delivery of processes of accountability, like we have instilled performance contracts with our leaders and so on and so forth. Now, so we go for the very things that will give the results that we want. When we build roads, it's energy, it's the telecommunications.
How easy as the president of a developing country, how easy was it to do these things? I mean, you know, you kind of say, well, there's telecoms and there's, I mean, I know you've, I think, quadrupled the electricity connections in the country over these past few years, but you still got a long way to go, obviously. But what's the toughest thing about doing those things?
Well, with Rwanda, it's even tougher than in other places. But still, we have to build on the mindset we have, that we start asking ourselves a simple question. If we want investments, we imagine what the investors have on their minds in order to make the investments, whether in electricity, in agriculture, and why particularly in Rwanda. So I think this has been covered very well, and it's very important because a small country like ours, and that's why everybody in the end is small relatively, and that's why integration is very important. So Rwanda's negatives are offset by being in a bigger community, and every country in this wider community, when we create integration, benefits as well from the scale of things in whichever angle. But a number of things that create difficulties which you are talking about. One is how are you going to get the resources required to actually put in these kinds of investments, whether it is the infrastructure investments in energy and other areas, or in agriculture? Second, do you have people, do you have the human resources actually that are going to deliver?
Right.
So that's why it is important to build the capacity. You build the capacity, but you also mobilize resources to invest, because the government alone cannot find the kinds of resources required for these investments. They are quite huge. Again, partnerships play a very big role. It's the government, it's civic society, it's the private sector and others that come together, bringing all the resources they may have to their disposal, and also making sure that the interests they have is well catered for.
Right.
Meaning, if they make the investments in this country, are they going to have the returns they want? Is there peace and stability that is required for them to function properly and deliver on the results? So there are so many things that come at the same time. So leaders have a problem of saying, well, there is so much being demanded of us to put in place. There is so much we need to invest in order to be where we want to be, but we will always be falling short of having the adequate resources required, so we have to make it attractive for people to make investments with us.
I guess what is important also is the prioritization. I mean, I found one of the toughest things in government is, everything's a priority in a way.
Yes.
I mean, I remember making a speech and I wanted to emphasize the importance of education. So I said my top 3 priorities were education, education, education. Mm-hmm. So I met someone the next day and they said, does healthcare not matter to you? It's a very difficult process, but you have to prioritize, particularly I think as a developing country. And one of the things that I think can accelerate the process of development is if there were greater regional cooperation. In other words, if you're breaking down barriers between countries. So you take East Africa or, the West African coast, you can think of enormous advantages that would come if countries were also cooperating with each other across the national divide. Yes. I mean, how important is that to you? How important, for example, would it be to get the railway line, your infrastructure is vital so that you can get your goods out to the sea?
Yes. You brought up a very important point of prioritization, and really it can be very difficult. Just to give you a quick example, and I come to that point. Even for us from the earlier on, when we talked about investing in ICT, there were people who thought we were crazy, said, the agriculture is not developed, there's not this, there's not that. You're talking about ICT, because I think it was being seen as something that we cannot afford to have. Until a very lengthy conversation, and we were able to show, for example, that when we are talking about ICT, it's not just a standalone thing that we are talking about. We are talking about even how this ICT, the information and communication technologies, are actually supporting all sectors that we have to invest in and that we have prioritized. When we got that going, then we saw actually that we are succeeding on the priorities we had set for ourselves, but also ICT was advancing, and on the basis that it was creating the linkages between these sectors that we wanted to prioritize.
This is obviously a big priority for the country in the future, and I saw for myself today your tech center, which is very impressive here. I mean, one other area that's obviously hugely important is agriculture. Howard, this is your speciality. It's your life work in many ways. So you're advising a developing country government. What would you tell them are the most important things to get right about the agricultural sector?
Well, you know, I'm in agriculture because my wife calls me low tech and high maintenance, and so I've never been able to get to the technology part. So I had to find something where I could pursue it. But you know, one of the challenges in Africa in general is that, and there's some countries that are very good examples where they have a very high percentage, maybe 80% of their population living in rural areas, yet they're spending a few percent on agricultural development or agricultural, you know, even policy. I mean, the time that is spent or not spent on policy. And, you know, if you look back at the United States, you know, at one point, you know, 98% of the population was on farms, and today it's 2%. And, you know, that's a huge change, but you can't do that. There's not many shortcuts in agriculture. I mean, you really have to do it right, and you have to do it thoroughly. So generally speaking, I think all countries need to spend a much higher percentage of their budget on agriculture, and they need to do it well, and they can't cheat on it. I mean, you know, there's always ways to cheat with numbers, and it needs to be real money that's spent and spent well. You know, I mentioned 10 years ago, I kind of wanted to do this idea, and the idea is to try to give a country a different type of training facility, an agricultural institute that, you know, there's in Zamorano in Honduras and Earth University in Costa Rica, there's some really great examples of practical institutions that train people in agriculture. And sometimes in a country like Rwanda or others, it's difficult to get people excited about agriculture. I was at the Gashora Girls Academy, and we had 5 young women sitting there who expressed some interest in agriculture, and 4 of them didn't seem all that enthusiastic, and I was trying to figure out why. And they said, well, I don't really want to spend my life hoeing in fields. And that was the mentality. I mean, that, you know, because they haven't had the opportunity to really understand when agriculture flourishes, what that means. It's plant science, it's biology, it's all sorts of things that kids can get interested in. And so the institute we want to build here is something that is driven by Rwanda, that is managed and operated by Rwandans to fit Rwanda. But the idea comes from a land-grant university type of system that built American agriculture. And the law was passed back in 1862, and it created these universities that had a mandate to develop agriculture. And it's 3 pieces. It's education, it's research, and it's extension. And in a country like this, extension is incredibly important. You have to get out and teach farmers, you know, what they can do better, how they can do it better, and what changes they can make. And so the institute we want to build is something that it's not a university. It's a practical agricultural institute, which means that everybody that comes out of that institute will apply what they've learned in some form or another in this country in agriculture. And it could be in processing, it could be in business, but it could be on the farm, and it could be that, you know, you train mechanics and you train people how to use equipment, and you train them different farming techniques. I mean, it's across the board. But that hasn't been done in a country that I'm aware of in the way that we're thinking of doing it. And I don't know, it's a big undertaking. I mean, but if there's one place we can do it, it's in Rwanda.
I think it's a really interesting idea, because you're actually building the capacity of the country to do its agriculture quite differently. Just one of the things that really interests me, you look around the world today, there are, people have generally learned how to do things. There's a lot of ideas out there. You can go to most places in the world and someone is doing something innovative or exciting. One thing I find really strange about government is its kind of inability to absorb the new thinking. It's just a sort of strange thing.
I'm accused of that all the time.
Yeah, but I mean, what you're doing with the Institute, right? How does that, in terms of the partnership that you have, what does that say, though, about the way that, for example, if we move on to our last part of this, how if you're a development agency and you're looking as to how to help a country, it just seems to me we do development in a very, very static and quite old-fashioned way. So in a sense, what you're doing through the Institute, you're doing it because you've got the resources as a philanthropist, but I mean, why isn't that type of idea the type of thing that, you know, some of the big aid agencies would be doing?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that, and it's not to necessarily be critical of them, but they're bureaucracies, and so they have these systems in place and these processes. And I'll tell you what happens, because you see this, and I've been involved in a number of corporations over there, and I've seen the same thing happen, which is people don't want to make a decision because they know that if they make a mistake, it can have consequences, and so they're just not willing to do it. If you look at even NGOs that aren't big government agencies, what do they do every year? They have a big gala and they go raise money. Can you imagine what it's like to stand up in front of 1,000 people and say, well, we failed a lot this year, and here's, you know, I mean, people aren't going to write a check. I mean, they don't want to know about failure. They want to know about success. So what's that drive you to do? It drives you to pick the easy things to try to do. Now, not all, I'm not saying everybody does that, but it is ingrained in both big and small organizations. And so I think actually it's the donors that need to lighten up and to give the agencies more room to be more innovative and to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes and then be more successful. So I think our system is not a system that is set up for large successes on a frequent basis, and I think we need to change that.
Right. Well, I think it's a really interesting point, but it's not just about the risk-taking, it's also that you are building, in a way, what I would call sort of institutional resilience and capacity long-term for the country. So, Mr. President, one of the things, okay, you've got a great deal of experience of the donor community. I mean, there is a great debate going on in the development community about doing development differently, which I believe passionately has to happen. What is it that what do you think should be done? I mean, what are the things that you're looking for from the development community today on the base? And you know, you've got a significant amount of experience now sitting on the other side of the fence. Mm-hmm. So what do you say to them?
It starts from, first of all, we appreciate partnerships, and everybody says so, that they appreciate partnerships, working together. But in our case, even more, we would like to have ownership of the very things we should own and actually be doing for ourselves. So I think the problem has always been, how do we manage these two imperatives together? One of partnership, another of ownership, so that if you are helping a country, there is, you bring the resources, but we appreciate that you can bring ideas as well as to how those resources should work for the people where you are putting the resources. But that does not really substitute for the people of that country to be able to make choices of what they want to do and how they want to do it. So then we should have a conversation. The donors, the recipients should have a conversation. You are giving us resources. What do you expect the resources to do? And therefore, as we talked earlier, prioritization. People of different countries that are recipient of these donor resources should really be able to say, this is what we want, this is what, and then work together to monitor that, one, the resources are being utilized properly, the results that the donors and the people being assisted want are actually being achieved, and so on and so forth. So we have been very stubborn on this one, and sometimes got a thorough beating for it, but we haven't given up. We've been very stubborn. We insist on saying, we want aid. It's very important. It makes a big difference. But can you allow us to participate in deciding where this money goes, and together we monitor how it is utilized, and also monitor and assess whether the results we all expected are the same.
But Tony, think about what development is. Development is going into some of the toughest places, facing some of the challenges that we've been trying to solve for many, many years, and you're working in less than ideal conditions. So if you want to play it safe, it's going to be tough. I mean, you don't want to sit in front of the U.S. Congress as the USAID person and say, you know, well, things didn't work well this year. You need, just for survival, you need to have success. And I think it drives a certain type of thinking and a certain type of participation.
Well, I think there are two, because obviously I studied this a lot, one side of the fence in government and then slightly differently now outside of it. I think there are two problems. One is that international institutions find it very difficult to take risks because the safest thing, exactly as you were saying, but what that means is they get very bureaucratic and they get very clunky. But the second thing is, if you can point to some food being distributed to some needy people, which is absolutely right and necessary, okay, that is a simple political story to tell. It's a very visual thing, right? Here are some poor people, we are wealthy people, we've given to poor people. Okay. If what you're doing is actually building the capacity of the country to get on its own feet and wave the aid community goodbye, which is really, I think, the objective should be, that's a different type of conversation. Yeah. And my obsession is to get us shifting the conversation about aid and development from what is a short-term palliative set of measures to actually building the institutional resilience of countries to be able to be successful. Because the whole point about governance and government is, you know, we kind of know what works and what doesn't. I mean, I think that's what's kind of fascinating about it. You know, you go around the world and, you know, sparing the president's blushes, I mean, you can see next door to here, governance makes a difference. Okay, and sometimes makes the biggest difference. Yes. So my view is we should focus on that. So we're just about running out of time. I just wanted to get to one final thing, which is around the issues to do with leadership. Now, Mr. President, you've come under a certain amount of international criticism for the fact that you will put yourself forward for a third term following the referendum in the country. I'm actually going to throw this one to you first, Howard. You know, you've come here, you've been here, you've done work for a long time. What's your thought?
Well, the bottom line is that if we didn't think President Kagame was going to be here for another 7 years, we wouldn't even consider doing what we're trying to do. That's the bottom line. What is my reasoning behind that? You know, it's funny, because thinking that that could come up, I went back and looked at some of the history of the United States. You tend to forget about some of the things that happen in your own country. And every democracy goes through challenges and changes. I mean, we've had 27 amendments to our Constitution. Constitutions can be amended. And I think what Rwanda did in this case, driven not by the president, but driven by almost a third of the country in petitions. I mean, in making a very strong statement about how they felt about their future. This is not my future or your future, Tony. This is the Rwandans' future. And so it is imperative that they drive what they see as the important and critical factors that will achieve success, not someone from the outside. So I look at this process that's been taking place, and I think, you know, you can compare it to a lot of countries across the continent, and I don't know that there's too many that you can compare to a process that went through the petitioning and the parliament and was challenged and the referendum was passed. We worked on the South Sudan referendum, and that was very successful. You know, there are things that have taken place, but they're pretty rare. So, you know, I think about it in terms of, let's look at the results, okay? Let's not put form before substance. Let's not be so critical from the outside that we think we know better than Rwandans know what they want in the future. And Louise touched on it, you know. People love to talk about gender equality. I mean, this is something you hear from everybody today. But Rwanda's done it. I mean, they quietly just knocked the ball out of the park. There's nobody else in the world that compares. The majority of their parliament, or I shouldn't say majority, but well over half of the parliament are female. Half the ministers are female. Half the Supreme Court is female. There's no other country that can say that. So that's the substance. Now someone can say, you know, but you went through this constitutional amendment and you did this and you did that. The substance is that in 1994, the World Food Program estimated there were 800,000 people that were probably not going to survive without significant and quick food aid. Today, this country has pulled 3.5 million or more people out of poverty. That's substance, okay? So when I look at the results, I see no other answer other than this is what Rwandans want. They have proven it. They've done it themselves. They've made the statement, and there's a reason they've done it.
So I should allow you last word on this, Mr. President. And I, you know, obviously, since I've fought a third term myself, it's a little. I didn't get to finish mine, but that's a whole other story. But you know what the criticism is, that people worry that the third term turns into forever, and you know, it's obviously it's a legitimate anxiety that people have from the outside.
Yeah.
But it's right.
Tony, much as you started with Howard, it's not his fault. But neither is it mine, in actual fact. But before I say what it is, you know, a while ago we were talking about learning lessons or not learning lessons, and I think the world is characterized by not learning lessons. That's why the way we dispense aid and use it that hasn't worked so successfully continues for decades and nothing changes. So we are really not learning lessons. It's like we just keep helping, we are doing good, but in the end, what do we really want to achieve? And it goes on forever. In the same way, in this particular area, it's about, do we learn lessons about politics, contexts, and so much held by history in terms of lessons that should be learned. And in the end, really, what do we want to achieve? And unfortunately, this issue of third term or whatever people call it, or not putting term limits, but which is even mistaken because in our constitution, the new constitution, actually there is respect for term limits. I think what people are talking about maybe is a mistake, which they call it a mistake, that was, according to them, made by Rwandans. And it has almost narrowed to a single issue and the person. It's about, okay, everything is going fine, you know, this, you know, referendum, you know, it went well, and no, but why is this man staying? But I'm trying to tell everybody in this room and to answer the question. And that's why I said it's neither Howard's fault nor mine. By the way, I didn't ask for this thing at all. In fact, I have told Rwandans in several meetings, I had several meetings with people in my party, and I was bringing up the point you've raised, that it's not just what they think as Rwandans, it's what other people elsewhere think also about us. Whether we are right, and are very convinced that we are right, in the end you cater for other people's opinions and what they may be thinking about you. And all this came up for discussion. I was actually trying to tell my people that, you know what, there is room you can find somebody else. Maybe you need to take a risk and look for somebody else. You are saying you can't let me go. You want me to stay because of, whatever the results you have had in the past. Maybe you need to take a risk with somebody else from the, amongst the RPF, cadres or elsewhere. And they kept saying, no, we are not ready to take risks. We want you to stay. I said, but I'm having difficulties staying, and anyway, people outside have difficulties with me staying. So about thinking about that, they would say, well, but those same people from outside, when the country was on fire, burning almost to extinction, these fellows were just, so there were these arguments back and forth. So I'm trying to tell you that maybe people need to go beyond what they are used to. This one can't go beyond this, beyond that. What is the right time in dealing with the country's problems, and the particular problems, for example, for Rwanda? And in fact, this going back and forth and the arguments are the ones that, in the end, it was like I was put in a cage. It's like, are you running away from this, or are you staying with us? Or and I came to think, am I having to make a decision because of the outside opinion, or what the people of this country are saying, and maybe go along and correct the course as maybe at the right time. So which is the right time? I cannot determine that. Neither can the outsiders actually decide that or determine that. So the debate was very healthy, and that's what it is. And maybe it's damned if we do, damned if we don't. So in the end, we had to make a decision.
Sounds like politics, but...
Yes.
But Tony, let me just say this. I've spent my whole life taking risk. That's what I do.
Now, you've been very well behaved up to now.
Well, but what the president's talking about is a risk that I don't want to take and our foundation doesn't want to take.
Yeah.
And I don't think Rwandans want to take it.
Okay. So, I mean, this has been thank you both very much for the discussion. I mean, my reflection is that, 22 years ago, when the country was in the middle of those terrible times, if you'd said in a couple of decades you'd be hosting the World Economic Forum in Kigali, I think people would have been surprised. And I think whatever the debates and controversies, this is a country that is an amazing country that's seen extraordinary progress. And my final reflection is some things never change, one of which is the importance of leadership. And some things in this world today are constantly changing, which is the importance of new ideas. And if we can combine the leadership with the ideas, we've got a chance of making progress, not just in Rwanda, but across the continent of Africa. So thank you both very, very much indeed. My apologies to you and to Louise for one of us not being female, but it's too late for any of us. And can I just say to the President and to all the people in the government of Rwanda that helped, and to the World Economic Forum have helped put on this conference, you've done a great job, and it's an honor for all of us to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.